Before tanks became symbols of armored power, steel monsters in war films, and rolling engines of fear, they were something much more desperate. An answer to a battlefield where human beings were being destroyed faster than they could advance. In World War I, trench warfare turned the ground itself into a trap of mud, wire, shell holes, and machine gun fire. Armored cars could not cross it, infantry could not survive it. And so a new machine was imagined, one that could crawl through chaos, crush obstacles, and carry protection into places where men had been sent almost helplessly before. Because the history of tanks is not only the story of a weapon, it is the story of how human beings tried to make survival move through the deadliest ground on Earth. Before the tank, modern war had reached a terrifying imbalance. Industrial weapons had become devastatingly efficient, but movement on the battlefield had not kept up. Machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery could stop men in enormous numbers, while the muddy trench systems of World War I made old ideas of mobility feel almost useless. Britannica notes that trench warfare ended the usefulness of armored cars and pushed armies toward tracked armored vehicles that could move off roads, over broken ground, and through wire. In other words, the tank was born not from ambition alone, but from military desperation. That is what makes the tank's beginning so human and so tragic. It was designed to restore movement where death had frozen it. The first important British prototypes reflected this urgency. Britannica notes that Little Willie was the first tank, followed quickly by Big Willie, which was designed to cross wide trenches and led to the Mark I, accepted by the British Army in February 1916. These early machines were crude, loud, mechanically fragile, and uncomfortable for the crews inside them. But hidden inside that ugliness was a revolutionary idea. Armor and tracks could move together across terrain that had defeated almost everything else. And that was the first great transformation. The battlefield stopped belonging only to exposed bodies. It began belonging to armored movement. That change mattered because it altered what an army could imagine. A soldier no longer had to cross every yard of killing ground entirely in the open. Protection could move with the advance. Firepower could be carried into the broken zone between trenches. A machine could now do what horses, carts, and armored cars could not. The tank did not end battlefield horror, but it changed the geometry of survival. The first combat use came in 1916. Imperial War Museums records identify 15 September 1916, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette on the Somme, as the day tanks first went into action, with Mark I tanks moving toward targets such as Flers and Thiepval. Some broke down, some got stuck, some frightened the enemy, some simply showed what the future might look like without yet fully delivering it. That is often how history works. A machine can arrive before it is truly ready and still permanently change what comes next. But maybe that is the hidden twist in the early history of tanks. They were not instantly powerful because they were effective. They were powerful because they proved a possibility. The first tanks were limited, but they revealed that armored tracked vehicles could break the old logic of trench paralysis. Once that possibility existed, militaries could not ignore it. The tank was no longer just an experiment. It had entered the imagination of war. From that point onward, the question was no longer whether armored fighting vehicles mattered, but how far they could be improved. And improvement came quickly. During and after World War I, designers began thinking harder about speed, layout, crew efficiency, and firepower. One of the most important milestones was the French Renault FT. The Tank Museum describes it as often considered the first modern tank because its layout driver in front, engine in the rear, and a fully rotating turret on top became the basic arrangement for most later tanks. That is an enormous historical shift. The tank stopped being just a battlefield novelty and became a recognizable machine type. That was the second great transformation. The tank stopped being merely experimental. It became modern in form. And once a weapon finds the form that fits its purpose, its impact grows much more quickly. The Renault FT mattered not only because it fought, but because it taught later designers what a tank could be. Some inventions change history by being the first. Others change history by becoming the template. The FT was one of those machines. Then came the years between the wars, when armies argued over what tanks were truly for. Were they meant to support infantry slowly and heavily? Were they meant to move fast and break through? Those questions became brutally important in World War II. Britannica describes blitzkrieg as a tactic built around surprise, speed, and superiority in material or firepower, most closely associated with Nazi Germany. Tanks, working with aircraft and mobile forces, became central to this new style of war. The tank was no longer only a problem solver for trenches. It had become an instrument of rapid shock, and that changed the emotional meaning of the tank. In World War I, it looked like rescue from deadlock. In World War II, it often looked like fear in motion. A tank column advancing quickly across open ground created a different kind of terror than the static slaughter of the trenches. It was speed, momentum, noise, fire, and steel arriving together. The machine that had once tried to solve the paralysis of war had become one of the most visible symbols of mechanized offensive power. The tank could now embody not only protection, but domination. Yet tank history in World War II is not only about Germany. The war also proved the importance of other designs, especially the Soviet T-34. The Tank Museum notes that when Germans first encountered the T-34, 76 inches 1,941, it came as a nasty surprise, and quotes General von Kleist calling it the finest tank in the world at that time. The T-34's sloped armor, mobility, and effectiveness made it one of the defining tanks of the war. It showed that armor was not just about thickness, it was also about design intelligence. And maybe that is another lesson hidden in tank history. A tank is not powerful simply because it is big. It is powerful when its design matches the reality of war. That is why some tanks become legends while others become cautionary tales. The machine must balance mobility, armor, firepower, production, and repair. A perfect tank on paper means little if it cannot be built, maintained, or moved where needed. Tank history is therefore not only a story of battlefield force, but of engineering compromise under pressure. After World War II, the tank did not disappear. It evolved again. The old division between light, medium, and heavy tanks gradually gave way to the main battle tank concept, which sought to combine mobility, protection, and firepower in one central armored form. While the details vary by nation and era, the deeper trend is clear. The tank became less about many separate categories and more about one dominant armored fighting idea. The machine kept adapting because war kept changing around it. But the emotional complexity of the tank also deepened, because tanks were never only weapons. They were also places where human beings were trapped together inside war. From the outside, a tank can look almost inhuman: steel, tracks, guns, weight. But inside it are crews dealing with heat, noise, fear, confusion, claustrophobia, and the knowledge that armor is both shield and coffin. That is one of the strangest truths of tank history. The machine seems to reduce war to metal, yet it also compresses human vulnerability into a very small space. The steel is powerful, but the people inside still carry the terror. This is an inference, but it follows directly from what tanks were built to do and the conditions under which crews operated. And that may be why tanks remain so emotionally charged in memory and culture. They symbolize industrial power, yes, but also the 20th century's habit of turning survival into machinery. A tank is a machine built to cross the worst ground humans create for one another. It is not elegant, it is not gentle. It is the answer to a battlefield that has already become intolerable. In that sense, the tank always carries the violence of the problem that called it into existence. Today, tanks still matter in military planning, but their meaning is more complicated than simple dominance. Modern warfare includes missiles, drones, precision-guided weapons, aircraft, and new forms of surveillance that constantly challenge armored vehicles. Yet tanks persist because protected mobile firepower remains valuable. The story of the tank is therefore not over. It continues as a conversation between armor and vulnerability, movement and detection, shock and survival. This is an inference from the long continuity of tank evolution and their enduring role as armored combat vehicles. So when you think about tanks now, do not see only a weapon rolling across a battlefield. See the trenches that made them necessary. See Little Willie and Big Willie. See the Mark I entering combat on 15 September 1916 at the Somme. See the Renault FT discovering the modern tank layout. See blitzkrieg turning armored movement into shock. See the T-34 surprising the German army in 1941. See the crews inside the steel, trying to survive inside the machine built to survive for them. Because the history of tanks is, in the end, not just the history of armored warfare. It is the story of how human beings tried to force movement back into places where war had made movement almost impossible. And maybe that is why tanks still fascinate us. Not because they are only powerful, but because they were born from one of humanity's bleakest realizations. If the ground itself becomes deadly, survival must learn how to roll through it. If you stayed until the end, then maybe tanks no longer feel like just machines of war to you. Maybe they feel more like fear, survival, power, or one of those inventions that changed history because human beings had made the world around them unbearable. So I'd love to hear from you. When you think about tanks, what do they mean to you most? Protection, destruction, resilience, strategy, or something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell for more storytelling videos about the inventions and machines that quietly reshaped human history.